It's been 10 years since Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part Two was released in theaters. The final Harry Potter film and the much anticipated conclusion to one of the defining franchises of its time. I was there, overflowing with excitement and blown away by how far the beloved fantasy adventure had come. And in the years since that night, I haven't rewatched a single one of these movies, which is a little weird. As a #90s kid, I'm very much someone who grew up with Harry Potter. I read all the books, I saw every film in theaters, my family owned all the DVDs, I even wore a really embarrassing Lord Voldemort t-shirt. I can't find a picture of it on Google, but these equally embarrassing shirts will get the idea across well enough. Point is, I loved this series for a long time. They were quite possibly the first novels I ever read, and I remember rewatching the movies a lot as a kid. Even as I got older, the gradually rising dark tone and high stakes of later stories meant Harry Potter still offered me a lot, even as I became a more serious film buff. In 2010, I published a top 10 movies of the year list for the first time, and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 ranked in at number 4. A year later, Part 2 ranked at number 3. So, what happened? I never had a conscious, I don't want to play with you anymore moment, but since the series has ended, I've had no desire to go back, which is not the case for comparable franchises from my childhood and teen years. Perhaps my disconnect has less to do with the films themselves and more the periphery of the franchise. The Fantastic Beasts movies have certainly done a lot to sour the universe, the first film almost aggressively boring, and the second such a baffling mess of weird choices that it's almost hilarious. Maybe my issues lie more with the fan base, particularly that subsect of Potter fans who seem unable to interpret any aspect of reality without first filtering it through the lens of witchcraft and wizardry. I'm all for using fiction as a tool for understanding the world, but surely there's a limit, right? Elizabeth Warren is a total Hermione. I wonder who her Ron Weasley is, but let's not talk about he who must not be named. Shut the fuck up! Of course, if we're talking about odious Harry Potter figures, no one beats JK herself. Rowling's weird retcons to Potter lore or misguided forays into screenwriting may have tarnished some of the author's mystique, but they were also largely harmless forms of expression. The same cannot be said for Rowling's crusade as a gender-critical feminist, which essentially boils down to trivializing transgender people's experiences and misrepresenting trans women in particular as men masquerading in real women's spaces. Textbook fear-mongering transphobia, all the more dangerous given Rowling's substantial public platform. But none of this actually answers why I lost interest in Harry Potter. I'm not one to let disappointing sequels or prequels ruin the good movies for me. And while the hardcore Potterheads might annoy me endlessly, I can't say they beat the worst Star Wars fans when it comes to being insufferable, and I still love Lucas's saga of good and evil. As for Rowling, well, I may abhor Rowling's personal choices as of late, but for better or worse, an artist's unethical actions have rarely affected my abilities to connect to the art. No, there's something else here. Some reason why a series I grew up with and loved until the end quickly faded from my interests once the films were done. And to really know what this was, I think it's time I return to Hogwarts. I didn't reread any of the books, as it's really the film series that resonated with me the most as a kid and teenager, but I did rewatch all 8 Harry Potter movies. From Chris Columbus to David Yates, from Voldemort on the back of some dude's head to Voldemort turned to ash and ending up dead, I re-experienced the magic of the wizarding world.
Lumos Maxima!
But before I dive into the terrifying lows, dizzying highs, and creamy middles of Harry Potter, let's talk about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes in all manner of subjects, available to anyone interested in learning something new. I know a lot of my audience are aspiring filmmakers working with less than Harry Potter budgets. If you're looking to jazz up your production value without breaking the bank, I'd recommend Julian Klepper's class, How to Make Dope Low-Budget Films. Klepper covers all ends of production, from drafting your screenplay right through to post-production, and shows how to get the most from limited resources. Skillshare is also ad-free, and the first 1,000 people who click the link in the description will get a free 1-month trial of Skillshare's premium membership. Whether you're a pro looking to sharpen your skills, or a novice striking up a new hobby, Skillshare has got you covered. So having not watched any of these movies in a decade, the first question is, do the Harry Potter films hold up? The short answer is yes? Yes? Mostly yes. I mean, I certainly wouldn't call any of the movies bad, and at their best, they offer wonderfully thrilling fantasy adventure with some very endearing personalities. Revisiting these movies certainly gave me a renewed appreciation for the range in visual styles. Even while maintaining familiarity through elements in the setting and costumes, the filmmakers were also able to experiment a lot with the look and feel of Harry Potter. I think it's pretty neat that one series managed to incorporate so many different visual styles from divergent filmmakers while still maintaining an internal consistency. The early films in particular are almost like the kids' movie version of Mission Impossible, another series initially defined by letting different directors experiment with a basic template. And even when the producers settled on David Yates as the man at the helm, each film continued to try new visual ideas based on the material. The music throughout is consistently great too, though certainly at its best in the first 3 films, when scored by the legendary John Williams. His main theme for the series standing proudly among the great composer's best. And perhaps it goes without saying, but the adult actors throughout the series are simply amazing. Richard Harris, Maggie Smith, Robbie Coltrane, Richard Griffiths, John Hurt, Alan Rickman, John Cleese, Warwick Davis, Kenneth Branagh, Jason Isaacs, David Thewlis, Michael Gambon, Emma Thompson, Gary Oldman, Timothy Spall, Brendan Gleeson, Ray Fiennes, The Good Time Guy, Amalda Stanton, Helena Bonham Carter, Jim Broadbent, Bill Nighy, Kieran Hines, Warwick Davis again, but now he's a goblin. I know it's bad form to spend your video essay just reciting a long list, but I think it's worth stepping back and really taking in the volume of world-class actors who brought this world to life. This list isn't even all-inclusive. I probably could have listed another dozen or so actors. And this isn't like the MCU, bringing in heavyweights like Mads Mikkelsen or Cate Blanchett to just play generic bad guys. These characters have a lot of personality and allow the cast to really show their stuff. John Hurt, for example, has 1.5 scenes across the entire series, and he still makes a big impression. Plucking character actors from Mike Leigh's filmography wasn't just a gimmick to add some prestige to the series, but an opportunity to enrich the people within this universe. But time has also put the films into perspective, and they aren't quite as enchanting to me now as they used to be. At the very least, I'm willing to concede that listing each Deathly Hallows film as among the top 5 movies of their year was a bit overzealous, especially considering some of the great movies 2010 and 2011 gave us. I don't want this video to just become a review of the Potter films, but in order to find out why I fell off this series, recapping my thoughts is necessary. So, to summarize, the Chris Columbus movies are indeed the shakiest. The Philosopher's Stone deserves a lot of credit for launching this whole endeavor, particularly shining in both the cast assembled and how successfully the filmmakers introduced the larger world and central lore. It is a very strong foundation to build a fantasy adventure, and while it's easy to criticize some of the child actors, the characters still land and the trio's chemistry is already there. But the movie lacks cinematic flair, feeling almost like a literal translation of Rowling's novel rather than a filmed adaptation. This is most prominent in the film's third act. The chess game offers a wonderful opportunity for a creative set piece and is essential to the characters, but it's mostly relegated to contextless clips of statues exploding and reaction shots of the heroes. More egregious still is the climactic showdown between Harry and Quirrell. Basically just 2 dudes standing at each other, until Harry touches Quirrell, and Quirrell melts because Harry's mom loved him, or something. This is accurate to the source material, but it also squanders the dramatic potential movies offer in blocking, cinematography, and, movement. Chamber of Secrets does a lot to address these criticisms. Instead of climaxing with a bunch of nothing, Harry battles a giant snake with a sword. Talk about a glow-up. I especially like the sparse use of music near the beginning and deliberate sound effects to convey the story and amplify the tension. Columbus generally puts more work into cinematography and blocking, and the central mystery is also more involved this go-around. But the movie is also a blatant repeat of Philosopher's Stone. The Dursleys are mean to Harry, Harry goes to Diagon Alley for school supplies, Harry adventures off to Hogwarts, a Hardy Boys-style mystery is offset by classroom scenes, a Quidditch game acts as a midpoint action scene, Harry initially ventures into the final battle with backup but eventually fights the threat alone, and the movie ends with a celebratory scene in the main hall. It's fundamentally the same film, except now we're familiar with the world and the characters, so there's far less substance, even if the main plot is technically more developed. Plus, a lot of these scenes go absolutely nowhere. What does the Weasleys busting Harry out of Pivot Drive add to the film? Or Harry and Ron needing to steal the Weasley car to make it to Hogwarts? Why does it take the movie 30 minutes to get to Hogwarts, and 40 for the mystery plot to kick in? Why does the whole Polyjuice Potion subplot, which takes up an absurd amount of screen time throughout the middle of the film, amount to nothing more than Malfoy isn't behind the attacks? There is some fun to be found in these diversions, but they also grind the film's pacing to a halt.
Wish you were here, Hermione. We need you, now more than ever.
We need you, Black Dynamite, now more than ever.
Thankfully, Prisoner of Azkaban largely lived up to my memories. If any Harry Potter movie is truly great in its own right, it is this one. There's a lot to be said about how Alfonso Cuarón elevated the movies through more expressive cinematography, moodier visuals, and just a generally stronger sense of direction, but I think the core of what makes Azkaban so compelling is really Harry himself. While a bit of a generic Dickensian orphan in the first two films, Harry really comes into his own here. He isn't just investigating the central mystery because his name's on the poster, but because he has a personal stake in the story, actively working to learn more about his parents and himself. He also has a much more specific arc in this film, moving from an angry young man seeking vengeance to someone who chooses a more altruistic justice. More than just beating a villain by the end, Harry really matures over the course of the story. Even the opening scene, which is mostly a self-contained bit of wackiness, still serves the greater narrative by introducing and emphasizing the anger Harry will struggle with and ultimately overcome. Complementing that sense of growth is a largely standalone story. Azkaban certainly introduces characters and concepts which will be elaborated on in later films, but its plot isn't just about developing the Harry Voldemort saga. Consequently, Azkaban stands on its own merits in a way the other Potter movies, even the best ones, really don't. Goblet of Fire is a step down in a lot of ways. It's certainly more about advancing the overall world than telling its own story, and Harry lacks the agency Azkaban gave him. But I still really like this movie, if for no other reason than it feels like a proper event film. The Triwizard Cup carries weight, which gives proceedings a certain gravitas, while set pieces like Harry's battle with a dragon or the final graveyard set showdown are largely the best from the series yet. It's perhaps a movie I like more for its individual scenes than for its story, but those scenes are really becoming of an epic fantasy. Even the Yule Ball, complete with the lamest band in the history of fiction, offers some fun teen drama. I do wish Harry had more of a story here, and elements like making Mad Eye not really Mad Eye make it a bit awkward when he shows up later, given, oh hey, he's a character I know and love, except, ooh, not really. But the movie works in spite of itself, with Voldemort's third act emergence plunging the series into darkness with chilling effect. The director to bring that darkness would be David Yates, who took the series mantle on Order of the Phoenix and maintains that position to this day. I largely like what Yates brought to the series from a visual and set-piece perspective, but this is also where adapting the tomes Rowling had written started to really weigh down on the filmmakers. With Phoenix, that means adapting a dense 870-page book into a lean 2 hours and 20 minutes. The result is montage-heavy storytelling, designed to blast through the plot as quickly as possible, and that has major drawbacks. Story beats like the death of Sirius Black, or the revelation that Harry's dad was actually a relentlessly cruel bully that are given a ton of weight in the book, are brushed off almost immediately in the film to get to the next story beat. Most of that story does remain intact, but it lacks a lot of its dramatic power. Half-Blood Prince, meanwhile, has the opposite problem, giving little attention to Voldemort or the main plot, and more content to just stew in teen melodrama and comedy with our last extended stay at Hogwarts. So laid back is the movie that the central mystery is revealed with little more than an indifferent shrug.
I'm the Half-Blood Prince.
Huh? Oh, right, the title. The thing is, both of these movies have elements I really like. Order of the Phoenix gives Harry back the agency he was lacking in Goblet, the character growing as both a leader and as a hero. The teen antics of Half-Blood Prince, meanwhile, are largely a lot of fun.
Hey, she's only interested in you because she thinks you're the chosen one.
But I am the chosen one. Okay, sorry.
I've come to really like these characters, and the actors are clearly enjoying themselves. But these movies are both so weighed down in plot excess that neither get to realize their full potential. With that in mind, it's not surprising that Deathly Hallows was split into 2 films. That way, the story could get a lot more breathing room without cutting out too much from Rowling's book. That and, the other reason. The split would have negative implications, in this series and elsewhere, but the decision mostly benefits Part 1. The climax is pretty inert given the point of division, but that added time does allow for a much more even pacing, one that maintains the tension and danger of the story, while still allowing for moments of levity.
Gorgeous.
What's going on in there?
Nothing.
The filmmakers are even able to add new beats, like this tender and melancholic dance scene between a lonely Harry and Hermione after Ron departs. I know a lot of fans, and Rowling herself, have come to think Harry and Hermione the more sensible pairing, but I kind of like that in spite of that, they don't get together. This scene adds a certain loss and regret that deeply complicates the trio's relationship, and does so without saying a word. It's wonderful stuff, though I do wish Yates stuck by his original song choice. Of course, Part 1 was just the appetizer. Part 2 is where shit gets real, where the small skirmishes would evolve into full-on battles, as Harry and Voldemort would finally come to blows. This is a movie I positively loved back in 2011, to the point of declaring it the absolute best of the series. Now, I think it's one of the weakest entries. It's not bad exactly, and I do probably prefer it to Chamber of Secrets, but splitting the last book into 2 films severely harms this latter half. Put simply, there's really not a lot of story left. Harry faces death, is reborn, and ultimately triumphs over Voldemort. There's some extra wrinkles, notably the Snape revelation, but after 7 movies, there isn't really a lot of room left for Harry or his friends to grow. And as for the epic final confrontation between good and evil, honestly, it's kinda lame. Harry and Voldemort stand at each other pointing their colored beams until a technicality over the Elder Wand ownership allows Harry to triumph and Voldemort dies. Hey, remember in Order of the Phoenix when Dumbledore and Voldemort threw all sorts of unique spells at each other? And it's not only a dazzling visual splendor, but also a more interesting duel because the characters aren't just trying to overpower, but also outsmart each other? Why can't we get some of that here? You might argue the scene's not about the spectacle, it's about the emotions of the characters. But, come on. This is a fantasy series about witches and wizards. I don't think it's unreasonable to want a little spectacle. What good is magic without a little razzle-dazzle? Maybe they were trying to pay homage to the first movie's climax. Finally, we come to the film's epilogue, the end of the saga, as we see our trio of heroes now as adults, sending their own children off to Hogwarts. It's not a bad ending per se, but it is an odd scene. And there are two reasons I don't think it works as well as it did in the novel. First, Rowling's books spend a lot more time focusing on the day-to-day living of the characters, with a lot of emphasis on their classes, passing exams, and their future ambitions. So to see the characters living as adults is a comforting payoff. But the movies never really had enough time to delve into the minutiae of these characters' lives, and therefore this payoff carries a lot less weight. I'm certainly not getting misty-eyed over the enduring marriage of Harry and Ginny, especially given the two barely have any scenes together in the movies. The other, and I think more fundamental reason the scene doesn't really work, can best be explained by Jean-Luc Godard of all people, specifically his idea that every film is a documentary of its actors. And for a decade, the Harry Potter series documented the growth of its young cast. Year after year, audiences could see Harry and his friends age in what felt like real time. For kids especially, that meant getting to grow up alongside the characters. Consequently, it's weird when the Deathly Hallows tries to cheat ahead 19 years in its last 5 minutes through makeup and CGI. It's not that the effects are even bad, they're pretty decent as far as these things go, especially for the time, but it's still uncanny to have spent years watching these people age for real, only to then fake it at the finish line. But beneath my criticisms of the final film's execution, or how the bisected nature of the story adversely affects the second half, there's something deeper that bugs me about the Deathly Hallows Part Two. Something that retroactively hangs over the series as a whole. Explaining this involves taking a step back and asking what this franchise is actually about. JK Rowling has spoken many times about how a core message of Harry Potter is realizing authority should not necessarily be trusted. In these discussions, she's usually referring to the corruption of the Ministry of Magic or the Death Eater's use of fascist imagery. But even the most unassuming sources of authority are proven to be unreliable. Put bluntly, Harry Potter is a children's series about learning that you can't really trust adults. This is a reading Mikey Newman elaborates on in his Story of Harry Potter 3-parter video series, which I'd highly recommend, but film after film repeatedly demonstrates the adults in Harry Potter to be untrustworthy. In the first 2 films, this is represented in pretty one-dimensional characters. The abusive Dursleys, the murderous Quirrell, the obvious conman and liar Gilderoy Lockhart. Family and teachers, 2 pillars kids are meant to trust and respect, both shown to be vile and cruel. But starting with Prisoner of Azkaban, things become more complex. Heroic characters like Arthur Weasley and McGonagall keep secrets from Harry about his parents and their relationship to Sirius. Secrets which become all the more painful once unearthed. Goblet of Fire pushes this yet further, with the Hogwarts faculty allowing Harry to participate in a deadly game for which he is too young, despite knowing some sort of suspicious trap is at play, a choice that leads to the resurrection of Voldemort and the murder of a student. By Order of the Phoenix, the kids are openly leading an insurrection themselves, while the adults of the Ministry ignore the growing violence at their door. This movie also contains the most destabilizing blow of all, the revelation that Harry's dad and his best friends were actually bullies who tormented a weaker person just because they could. Even the most sacred adults in this series are revealed to be fallible. And at the center of these disappointing adults is one Albus Dumbledore himself. The prime source of knowledge and wisdom in Harry Potter, the archetypical mentor of Harry's hero's journey, Dumbledore repeatedly fails Harry, placing him in far greater danger than necessary through lies and neglect. This is most prominent in the middle of the series, Dumbledore carelessly endangering Harry throughout the Triwizard Cup, and then neglecting him for a year throughout Order of the Phoenix, despite Harry clearly suffering through an emotional trauma and in desperate need of guidance.
Look at me!
But even when Dumbledore isn't being actively negligent, his help is still unnecessarily cryptic, choosing to aid through riddles and suggestions rather than just telling Harry what to do, including not telling Harry that he himself is a Horcrux who will have to die at Voldemort's hand before Voldemort can be defeated.
Dumbledore sends you off to find all these Horcruxes, but doesn't tell you how to destroy them. Doesn't that bother you?
A lot of this obtuseness is rooted in dramatic license. It's more satisfying to watch characters solve problems themselves than to just be given solutions, and it's more dramatically poignant for Harry and the audience to learn he a Horcrux as a late twist. But diegetically, these decisions also align with Dumbledore's tendency for manipulation. I mean, hell, consider how Dumbledore reacts when Snape confides Voldemort's plan to murder the Potters and pleads Dumbledore protect them.
Hide her. Hide them all. I beg you.
What will you give me in exchange, Severus?
Jesus Christ, dude! Throughout the films, Michael Gambon's performance really plays into these darker aspects of the character, often coming off as a bit sinister and even cruel. Rather than the grandfatherly warmth Richard Harris brought, Gambon is much more imposing. This interpretation is probably best summed up in this famous divergence from the Goblet of Fire, when Dumbledore questions how Harry's name was entered in the cup. Rowling writes, "Did you put your name into the Goblet of Fire, Harry?" he asked calmly. Versus the films...
Harry, did you put your name in the goblet of fire? No, sir. You asked one of the oldest students to do it for you? Here, this, calm down. Calm down!
But the Deathly Hallows balks at fully committing to this criticism, ultimately reaffirming Dumbledore as a wisely sage, and even justifying Snape's psychological torments as coming from a place of love. To be clear, I do like the Snape twist, a lot in fact. It adds a lot of detail to his character, and Rickman's performance in the reveal is achingly vulnerable. This scene is a fan favorite for a reason, and the movie would undeniably be lesser without it. But it's also weird that the movie pivots away from its cynicism towards adults, and instead moves toward full-on valorization.
Albus Severus Potter.
You take pride in being an insufferable know-it-all.
You were named after 2 headmasters of Hogwarts.
Prepare yourself.
One of them was a Slytherin. And he was
Your father was a swine.
the bravest man I've ever known. Stop it!
Is this what you call control?
And if you're gonna valorize some of the adults, surely there's better choices than these two. How about Hagrid? Hagrid never lied to Harry or subjected him to sustained bullying over a period of years. I mean, I guess there was that one time he led Harry and Ron into a nest of giant spiders who then tried to eat them, but by Hogwarts standards, that's pretty minor. Or how about McGonagall? While Snape and Dumbledore were far too eager to throw Harry to the wolves in the Triwizard Cup, McGonagall was the only person to be like, no?
Potter is a boy, not a piece of meat.
Regardless, I'm not saying Dumbledore should have become a villain or that Snape didn't deserve sympathy. It's just frustrating for the series to so thoroughly demonstrate the ways its adults harm children, either through outright malice or misguided negligence, only to not pull the trigger at the finish line. But while that critique might inform my current stance on Harry Potter, it doesn't really address why I never revisited the films after 2011. My disappointment with the finale was all born out of my latest rewatch, and not at all reflective of my sincere enthusiasm felt on release. You could argue I was just caught up in the hype back then, and that's probably true to an extent, but I did sincerely love this ending for a time. Similarly, the reading of Harry Potter as a series about how adults lie to and manipulate children is one I first got from Movies with Mikey, and I don't think I saw his Harry Potter videos until about 2 years ago. So while failure to deliver on that theme does bother me now, it isn't why I stopped watching. And the further I got into my Potter marathon, the more I realized looking to the text for why I stopped might not be the best approach. Something curious I noticed as I went through the films again was just how fresh the early ones were in my memory. It might have been a decade since I'd watched any of these movies, but it didn't feel that way. So much was still familiar. Not just the stories or the more iconic scenes, but the simplest details. These were movies that, unbeknownst to me, had become permanently seared into my memory. But after Goblet of Fire, those memories got a lot hazier. I still knew the plots and could recall a lot of the big moments, but there was a lot of, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Elements that I could recognize I'd seen before, but hadn't really left any mental impression on me. And it suddenly became clear that it was really just the first 4 Potter films that I watched over and over again. Starting with Order of the Phoenix, these movies took a lot less of my time, and while it would be easy to pin that on David Yates, I think it's more important to reflect on my own life between movies 4 and 5. Goblet of Fire was released in November of 2005. I was 11 years old, a few months into 6th grade, and beginning to really expand my interests. This was at the height of my wrestling obsession. Chris Nolan's first Batman film had reignited my passion for the character, which led to a dive into comic books and rediscovery of Batman the Animated Series. R-rated movies like The Matrix and Terminator 2 slowly began to enter my rotation. And perhaps most profound of all, this is also when I discovered heavy metal. For the first time, I started to discover art not because it was popular with other kids my age, but because it felt more specific to me. And crucially, these works felt a lot more adult than Harry Potter. Whether they actually were more adult is up for debate.
You and God versus me, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, and the product of my semen, my son Shane.
A lot of this stuff was every bit as childish as Harry Potter, if not more so, but that isn't how it felt to me then. By the time Order of the Phoenix hit screens in July of 2007, I still liked Harry Potter, but I had also vastly expanded my interests. Unless I make it sound like my entire personality was informed by the media I consumed, I should also stress that my life fundamentally changed between 2004 and 2007. My family moved towns in the summer of 2004, leading to starting at a new school with an entirely different group of people, and with very few exceptions, never seeing any of my old friends again. The next year, I changed schools again. In the midst of all this, there was a certain profundity to Goblet of Fire's ending, which is all about stepping out of childhood and entering the uncertainties of adulthood.
Everything's going to change now, isn't it?
More than any other Harry Potter movie, Goblet of Fire is about growing up, and I felt like I was growing up too. Again, much of this was a matter of perspective. By every measure, I was still a naive child living in blissful ignorance, but I still felt like I was outgrowing childish things. It was right around this time that Cars convinced me I was too old for this Pixar stuff, which led to me missing Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up in theaters, so hey, who's the real idiot? Anyway, I never formally wrote off Harry Potter as kids' movies I wouldn't watch anymore. The gradually darkening tone still offered me a lot, and I still saw the series through, both the films and the novels, with excitement and enjoyment. But there was also a clear shift in my life, where Harry Potter went from being something important to me to just being more movies. Movies I liked, movies I sometimes loved in fact, but ones that weren't inherently special to me anymore. Why did it take me a decade to revisit Harry Potter? I think it's simply because the time in my life when those movies really mattered had long passed. For some, that might be an anticlimactic ending, but it's the reason I wanted to make this video. There's a tendency here on YouTube to talk about films from childhood in extremes. Either the most wonderful, informative movies which inspired and uplifted, or, more commonly, wretched and vile trash looked back upon with scorn and mockery. But I think media from childhood is a lot like friends from when you're a kid. Most slowly fade with time. There's no grand fallout or big story. You just outgrow each other. And I think that's what happened between me and Harry Potter. And rather like old friends, it's still fun to reminisce. Rewatching these movies may have revealed limitations or shortcomings in this series I hadn't seen before, but it was also a firm reminder of what had captured my imagination in the first place. Maybe this series isn't for me anymore in the same way it was when I was a kid, but that doesn't mean I can't enjoy it. And despite many of the criticisms I've made here, I do think I'll want to watch them all again at some point. It might not be tomorrow, frankly it might not be for another 10 years, but someday I'm sure I'll go back. They may just be movies to me now, but for the most part, they're pretty darn good ones.